Welcome, everyone, to Jesu Parish in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm Father Jim Flaherty, pastor of Jesu, and I welcome you to this latest edition of Ignatian Moments, in which we share a particular aspect or characteristic of our Ignatian tradition and spirituality. Today, I'd like to share with you a particular way of praying within the Ignatian tradition. When I say it's within the Ignatian tradition, it's a central way of praying that Ignatius introduces in his spiritual exercises. It's called Ignatian contemplation. And what's key in praying with this Ignatian contemplation is the use of the imagination. Now, when I introduce this way of praying, you're typically on retreats that I'm giving to people who've not experienced Ignatian contemplation, and I say the emphasis is on the imagination. Many people will say, well, I don't have an imagination, or I don't have a good imagination. I take it they mean they don't have an artistic temperament. They don't write pictures, but really all of us as human beings have an imagination. If I were to ask you what life will look like to you after we get through this current pandemic with the emergence, hopefully, of a vaccine, and I ask you to imagine what your life would be like, I imagine, you would imagine, a very vibrant lifestyle, returning to your typical ways of social interaction, etc. But I imagine you would imagine other ways in which you might take better care of yourself, say during flu season. We tend to be a little casual during flu season, but now with this current pandemic, we've learned how to keep ourselves healthy through washing of hands, etc. So the idea is that we have an imagination. So what happens in this manner or way of praying is to take a particular scriptural text. Again, this is based on Scripture, and one that is very visual. Another way of talking about Ignatian contemplation, if we don't want to use the word imagination, we can use the word visualization. It is a manner of visualizing a particular text and entering into that text, inhabiting that text, seeing the people who are presented within the text, hearing what they say, setting the scene, as it were. Father Jim Voice, who presented a number of weeks ago during one of these Ignatian moments, talked about the application of senses, where we really do go into the text and we see the dusty roads, say, of Palestine. Or we imagine walking with Jesus and hearing him speak to us. Visualization, by the way, a lot of modern contemporary athletes use this as they practice their craft. You'll see, for example, professional golfers often stand behind a shot, and some of them will even close their eyes before they execute the shot, before they approach the ball. They're visualizing the shape of that shot that they want to hit, a fade or a draw. Visualizing helps them perform their athletic task, as it were. So in praying Ignatian contemplation, the idea is to find a text, and some are presented to us each day in the Scriptures that are very visual. There are texts in the Scriptures that aren't so visual. I think, for example, the prologue of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and the Word was God, and with God, etc. It's a little abstract. It's hard to visualize that. But there are other gospel stories that are very visual. Consider, for example, we just concluded with our Feast of Pentecost, the Easter season. And all those stories of Jesus' resurrection, how visual they are, whether it's the young women going to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus, only to discover that the tomb is empty. It's very visual. Or think about the disciples journeying away from Jerusalem towards Emmaus, discouraged because Jesus has suffered and died, and this stranger approaches them and they begin to converse, and then they break bread and they realize it is Jesus. Very visual text. So what I'd like to do is simply lead us in this Ignatian moment through a text that I generally begin retreats, when I preach retreats, with this particular text. It's important, too, when we select these texts or they're presented to us, for example, in our daily or Sunday readings, that they be rather brief so that we can really visualize and enter into the text. Ignatius also advises that we should be free to move beyond the text. So perhaps you begin with a particular story with Jesus and you begin to enter into conversation with Jesus, and that conversation becomes more and more personalized as you pray. It's important to know you should not feel constrained to stay within the given text. So the gospel passage I'd like to use, the story, is the story of the blind man Bartimaeus, and that is as it occurs in Mark's gospel. This is chapter 10 of Mark, verses 46 to 52. So it's a very short text. You know the story well, the blind man Bartimaeus. So I'll read it and then comment a bit, and then I would invite you this day, if you have the time, to perhaps pray this particular passage, or maybe there's a passage in Scripture that you've been reflecting upon that you'd like to pray in this manner. And so this is Mark the evangelist. And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, rise, he is calling you." And throwing off his mantle, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Master, let me receive my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. Now, this story of the blind man Bartimaeus is very visual. Jesus is traveling on the way to Jericho, and there are crowds gathering. And suddenly this blind man begins to shout from the midst of the crowds, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowds try to silence him, but he cries out all the longer, and Jesus engages him in conversation, ultimately asking him what he wants Jesus to do for him. So you can visualize the scene and place yourself within the scene. Most people, when they pray this text in this fashion, visualize themselves as the blind person. We are all, in some way, shape, or form, blind. We may not be physically blind, but we are spiritually blind. And yet we desire, we long, we want to see, we want to understand. So in praying this text, you might imagine yourself as that blind person. And Jesus saying to you, "What do you want me to do for you? What is your deepest desire this day?" And simply to pray with that desire and to be and remain in the text as you pray. So it's a very simple way of praying, a very visual, very imaginary way of praying, but it's one in which we really, our whole self, participate in the prayer. It's not simply mental, it's imaginative, it's heartfelt. We're saying things, we're voicing things, whether aloud or in the silence of our hearts, to Jesus, and we're entering into that encounter with the Lord. And then we just simply rest with what we experience in the prayer. Perhaps it's just simply the articulation of that desire, or maybe that conversation with Jesus extends further. Why do you desire this? What are you looking for? So that's a little bit a way of introducing Ignatian contemplation, a distinctly Ignatian way of praying. And again, I would suggest that the best way to learn this manner of praying, and that's very simple, is simply to practice it. Practice, practice, practice. Thank you.